Good afternoon and welcome to this talk on migration, pandemics and responses from the civil society organizations in India, lessons from COVID-19. The lecture is going to be delivered by Dr. Smita Tiwary, who is a fellow with us. Uh, the focus of our study is on understanding the relationship between the migration and the pandemic, and that is COVID-19. We all know that the plight of migrants during the COVID-19 pandemic was especially bad because now, of course, there are migrants and migrants. Not all migrants are poor, but the bulk of them, yes, they do migrate in our country from rural areas to the cities, basically working as unskilled labor. And during lockdown situation, when the cities did not offer any work, and many of these places did not have proper accommodation, and in any case, even if they did have it, they could not afford to pay for it, so they were often driven out by the landlords, and there were no means of travel, so they had to sometimes walk on foot back to their villages. Their livelihoods were lost, and there were all kinds of other problems that the migrant laborers faced. I must say that historically, this has always been the case. In situations of epidemics in cities, migrant laborers have always found it more difficult than the regular population of a city. Quite naturally, because those who have lived in the city for long, they have their property, assets, regular jobs there, have many more options to fall back upon as compared to migrants. And especially when the migrants are from far off regions, there are linguistic differences, for example, and there are other differences, then the plight of the migrants becomes even worse. If the migrants are from a nearby area, it is easy for them. It's like from one district to another. And suppose there are migrants who have migrated from the hinterland of a city to the city, obviously their situation is different as compared to those of other migrants who may have come from a long distance. So there are certain peculiar problems that migrants have to face in this situation. What is the role of civil society organizations in trying to ameliorate their situation during pandemic? That is one of the focus areas of Smita. We have seen, of course, civil society organizations trying to do many things during the pandemic. We will hear more of it from our speaker today. There is no doubt that whatever various parties did, it was certainly inadequate, but that does not take away from the sincerity and effort of various organizations, individuals who went out of their way to try to help the migrants with food, water, medicine, transport, so on and so forth. So, with these words, I would like to welcome all of you to this talk, and I extend again a very warm welcome to Dr. Smita Tiwary and request her to proceed with her lecture.
Uh, Thank you, Prime Minister Museum and Library, for having me here, and thank you very much, sir, for this opportunity. Before I start my talk, I just want to mention that this is a work in progress since I'm at the half of my fellowship, and I would look forward to the observations and suggestions, whatever you may have after my presentation. So, starting with my talk. First, uh, as we know that migration is a movement of people from one place to another place, leaving one set of environment and entering into the another set of environment. And it can be long-term, short-term, voluntary, involuntary, internal, external. There can be different types of migration. But for the purpose of my study here, I have particularly chosen internal migration and the effect of COVID-19 on internal migration. According to the census 2011, the number of internal migrants is estimated at 450 million, which is a 37% increase from the previous data, which is census 2001, and it constitute almost 42 to 45% of population as it is estimated. And it's been almost more than a decade, so the number might have increased enormously by now. We do not have any fresh data, any latest data regarding the number of internal migrants. So I'm relying on the data 2011 census. And we know that migration movement are usually driven by economic opportunities and access to better education, healthcare facilities, and in totality a betterment of life. And if we look at the major trends of migration, it is primarily rural to urban. In India, internal migration I'm talking about. Most of the migrants move from rural areas to urban areas to improve their living standards. And the economic implication, if we talk about, these internal migrants have contributed significantly to the economy of Indian economy, particularly the urban sector, and they work as a construction workers, manufacturing sectors, and informal labor, usually filling the gaps which is created in these industries. And it is estimated that migrant workers constitute almost 10% of GDPs. However, if we look at their picture and their situation, it is quite vulnerable. They are one of the most vulnerable section of our society, and they have created an informal market. Large number of them have working with the low wages, job insecurities, and lack of social protection. There is also gender dimension of migration. Women, female have their separate problem of, in context of migration. Usually they are engaged as domestic helps and also on construction sites, and they are also many a times exploited, paid very low wages. So this angle is also there. And then this rapid urbanization, what we are seeing today is requires more and more cheap labor, and this increasing number of migrant put this requirement of labor requires migrant from rural areas or wherever they are available to come to the urban settlements. And there the number they are increasing, they are putting pressure on the establishment of urban infrastructure. And usually we see that in mega cities or metro cities, these migrants are settling in slum kind of settlement are developed there, and they are usually residing there. So these are some basic trends that we have seen in Indian internal migration. According to the trends, 2011 census data again, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar have disproportionately highest number of out migrants. They are one of the highest migrant sending states, and Delhi and Mumbai are two of the most highest migrant recipient states. So for the purpose of this study, I have chosen this important corridor, migrants origin state from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, and the receiving states as Delhi and Mumbai, because migration is itself a very big and complex area, and one needs to specify exactly to for understanding a particular phenomena. Now, if we look at the civil society organization, I'm just trying to set the context, and then I will come to my objective. So civil society organization, basically they are non-profit, non-state and voluntary entities formed by the people in social sphere to look after socio-economic issues. They are not the state and neither the market. So usually they are termed as a third sector. These CSO represent a wide range of interest and ties, and they include community-based organization, non-governmental organization, labor unions, indigenous groups, charitable organization, faith-based organization, professional associations, and other foundations. So India has numerous socio-economic challenges such as poverty, inequality, gender discrimination, and environmental degradation, lack of access to health care and education. And these civil society emerged to bridge the gaps and work towards addressing these issues effectively. And they have gained prominence because of their ability to work at the grassroots level and also community-based interventions. So basically they are working closely with the marginalized communities, advocating their rights and empowering them to bring about positive change. Civil society often emerged in response to the government policy which they find inadequate to deal with a problem or some challenges in society, and the organization act as a watchdog, monitoring government actions and advocating the policy changes. As a concept, if we look at the civil society, as a concept, it is not a very new concept because the notion of dan or paropkar, it has been an integral part of Indian culture since ages. But yes, as a modern concept, civil society emerged in the 19th century as a twin process of resistance to the colonial policies and practices. At the same time, the reformative actions which were taken by the political leaders at that time during our freedom struggle movement. The creation of Brahma Samaj, Arya Samaj, we all are aware that they worked on the several issues relating to women, like they stopped child marriages or encouraged widow marriage. They focused on the women's education. There are a lot of issues that those organizations were focused on. Charter Act 1813, it resulted in increasing missionary activities in India with a special focus on promoting education, health and social welfare. And by the end of the 19th century, caste-based organization and peasant movements were being very prominent. And I'll not go into much detail in the historical part, but I'll just mention that in post-independence period, there was a effort or a unique feature that existed that time of integrating institutional link between the state and the society in India during Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's period, and it led to the creation of, like for example, Planning Commission in 1950, and many other organizations also come up. However, we see that this growth, this harmony between state and society somehow got diluted and started decline during the emergency period. But the irony is that even during emergency period, certain restrictions were put on voluntary organizations and their freedom of movement and operationality. But despite this fact, the rise of civil society organization did not stop there, because civil society organization usually developed where there is a lack of policy, there is a pressure on a population regarding certain issues. So despite the curtailment, the number of rise were on increase. Then Foreign Contribution Regulation Act was enacted in Parliament to maintain surveillance on political associations and voluntary organizations that received foreign funds. Growth of microfinance self-help group that provided saving and credit services to poor, and establishment of NABARD that facilitated credit flow and development of rural areas. Gradually increased governmental control on voluntary organization, which we see till today. Even till today in India, civil society organizations are not as vibrant, as active as in comparison to some of the other developing countries like Brazil or Latin American countries, where they have such a capacity to influence policy making of the government. But here in India, they are not reached to that level so far. They are also facing various challenges like FCRA clearance. Many times their license got revoked, and imposition of retrospective taxes, and pressuring private companies and philanthropists to redirect funding. then less flexibility and innovation in reorienting their normative and operational methodologies. So these are some of the challenges that is faced by civil society in India. Now, the objective of this study primarily is to understand the challenges faced by migrants in India since the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, the assistance that is available to them by civil society organizations in various forms, which we will discuss later. What are the good practices that have been adopted by civil society organizations, and what are the remaining gaps that they try to bridge or still existing? What are the new partnerships that they have entered into or emerged during the time of pandemic to mitigate with the crisis, and the perception of how government can engage with the third sector, because so far we have witnessed that government have not been very willing to collaborate with the civil society organizations, but the nature or magnitude of the crisis or the problem was such that it was believed appropriate that different sector of society should come and collaborate with the government sector. So regarding methodology, for this purpose of this study, because civil society organization is also an umbrella term having multiple, I have already mentioned that many types of groups are there. For the purpose of this study, I have particularly selected non-governmental organizations, then migrant-led groups, and the faith-based organization, for the obvious reasons that NGOs are those NGOs which are working in this area closely with the migrants, and they were very active during the pandemic period and provided a greater service to the need. And migrant-led groups which raised several concerns and voices relating to the problems of migrants, and then faith-based organizations which were also very active and played a very significant role during the pandemic period. Common instrument, a questionnaire was prepared, and it was a semi-structured interview was conducted by all the civil society organizations, volunteers, and all the interviews were conducted online, all over the phone, and the data has been analyzed and systematized. So this is for the methodology. Yes, this is the types of. So according to a report by ILO, with over 90% of entire workforce being informal and 85% of non-agriculture workforce being informal, India is an outlier among low middle income countries in this regard. Although India is one of the fastest growing large economy in the world, the informality of incidents has remained at this level for decades. A key factor here is the lack of documentation for worker, which is a real existing problem, because even after so many years and knowing that this informal sector laborers constitute a huge chunk of our economic growth story, we do not have an actual existing data regarding them. So this documentation workers from other state and economy, and combined with informal hiring practices by the contractors, that is also again a very big problem. So large gaps in data exist as a result. It is indeed notable that the country's economic transition from agrarian to industrial is a process that has not yet regulated labor. So most of these migrants remain invisible and untraceable in the bigger picture. We see that March 2020, lockdown was announced in India along with the other part of the world, and the containment measures which was resorted by the government were very strict on human mobility, the closure of domestic transport routes, and the sealing of state and national borders. The central government, followed by the regional government, they deployed Epidemic Disease Act, which was an act used in colonial period of the time, and it allowed government to take any action or any measure to contain this who breaks the law, or to containment of this pandemic. Many workers simply had no means to continue living in the cities with regular services. On interstate buses and long distance trains indefinitely suspended, many started walking back home. This mass migration over thousands of kilometers took place in height of summer, and stringent lockdown measures were exacerbated by the law authorities, often inflicting corporal punishment on those breaking the quarantine rules, with low-caste workers walking back home often targeted more. And the absence of clear and effective communication on quarantine measured hindered the law enforcement authorities, who at times could not differentiate between who are irresponsibly breaking the laws and who are completely unaware of it, or who have no other option uh, to do, or to opt any other way not to break the law. So the irony, these are the plights. The irony is that we see that the migrants who were employed in the companies or construction sites or manufacturing sectors, uh, when the lockdown took place, they were not given, there was cases of wage theft, there was cases of not paying protection in the time of crisis. So they were not at all able to conduct themselves in the place they were residing. But these companies who are unable to pay for their economic support and train tickets to the migrants during the crisis, they were paying for the flight tickets to bring them back when the lockdown ended. And this is something which shows that how important this, how significant this informal sector is, where the paymaster is not ready to pay for the betterment and security of the population, but they are again wanting them back for the work purposes or business purposes. According to the R.B. Bhagat, who is a professor at International Institute of Population Studies, Mumbai, he says that if we look at the flights from October to December 2020, 70 to 75% of them were filled with the migrant labor returning from their home to the work area. So these are some of the pictures of migrants during that pandemic period. Now, as I mentioned that a short questionnaire was prepared and interviewed with the volunteers of civil society organizations, and based on their responses, I have prepared or analyzed the data, which I will discuss it here. When asked from them that what were the major challenges faced by the migrants, the question was not asked directly to the migrants. My focus of the study was not migrants, but the civil society organizations and the picture of migrant through their eyes, how they saw migrants struggling, how they perceived the situation. So my interaction is with the civil society organizations and their responses. I will just chart out. Migrant workers faced unique challenges due to their high level of mobility, as they are unable to settle in their work destination and therefore falling outside the state's purview in both source and destination regions. They also include economically vulnerable, socially marginalized population, including women and children who are absorbed into highly informal, invisible, exploitative work arrangement at the lowest end of the labor market. The challenges faced by migrants are severe impact on their livelihood. Sudden job loss was one of the most important challenge faced by the migrants, which directly impacted their livelihood. Not only the job losses, but the non-payment of salaries and the back payment, migrant could not pay the rent and thus becoming homeless. Many employers gave out no information or assistance during the pandemic. In the words of an NGO representative, imagine losing your job and your accommodation at the same time. So this is the lack of information that caused panic and fear among people. Initially during lockdown, they were able to manage with the limited saving they had. As the period extended, many sought to return their home but had neither resources nor transportation. Even those who managed to go back to their native place faced problem related to quarantine And this is something very interesting thing which came out after the discussion, that while some migrants were kept at the quarantine centers with minimum facility, as we know that 14 days were the period of quarantine, in rural areas, some others just disappeared with the help of family members and kept hidden, because such were the unawareness or illiteracy regarding the importance of quarantine among those migrants, because in rural areas it is believed that being quarantined is not good, it is something looked as negative thing. So they just went there, and with their family help of their family members, they used to disappear, did not follow the proper procedure which was the guidelines prescribed by the government. Further, those returning to their native place would end up in farming and selling vegetables, as rural areas do not offer much opportunities. We know that the urban infrastructure has different settings. There are a lot of opportunities in every sector, and there are hundred of ways one can survive. But in rural areas, usually rural areas are self-sufficient. There are not much job opportunities. So even rickshaw pullers, vegetable senders, vendors, or those who are employed in construction sites or manufacturing industries all started doing the same thing, like working on a small piece of land or selling vegetables or doing small things at opening small ration shop. So these are the things they left with the very limited choices. They were anyway not very skilled, so they could manage to do it well. Hunger and the unavailability of food were another challenge, with ensuing health problems surfacing. Migrants faced with the challenge of traveling back in ongoing pandemic and fending for themselves, caring for family, meeting daily needs, finding transport, money to go back to home. These all are one of the challenges that impacted their overall existence. And adding to that, the brutality of local police while breaking some of the laws, or because of ignorance or some other reasons, uh, it was one of the traumatic memories of the pandemic. In some cases, migrants had the mental breakdown as well, and future uncertainties loomed large in their mind. When I asked to the NGO volunteers that which section was the most vulnerable among those, so they answered that the most vulnerable groups identified were elderly, women, children, and transgender community. Women have suffered mentally as well as physically due to domestic violence. For children, their education was impacted as schools were shut and access to online learning was not possible for every child. Among migrant workers, women tend to work in industries including garment, hospitality, beauty plantations, and construction. All of them have been deeply impacted by the pandemic. So they also faced additional threats, because female gender, they also faced additional threat of being sexually harassed and physical abuse and safety issues in quarantine centers. Children were most vulnerable due to the challenges of lack of immunization and nutritious foods, as Anganwadi centers were closed during the lockdown period. And a major concern was the lack of access to public healthcare facilities, especially for pregnant women and elderly people. Many senior citizens also worked as laborers for a living and sustain on daily wages. With the sudden imposition of lockdown, senior citizens were left with no remuneration or saving. Also, these senior citizens were at the higher risk from the COVID-19. So, how these migrants responded to the pandemic? What were their coping mechanism? How they developed their ways to deal with the crisis? There was a mixed bag. There was a mixed response. Some of the migrants themselves found some way to respond to the crisis, like migrants made efforts back to the home to sustain themselves. Some of them who were selling vegetables or pulling rickshaw has started similar enterprises. Women in particular are active in forming self-help groups and community-led initiatives. Some women started stitching like masks and uh, other small works. Women in then Women in particular are active in forming self-help groups and other community-led initiatives. Collectives like self-help groups, women's group, youth group, religious group took lead in the helping vulnerable migrants despite multiple challenges of mobility, infection, and financial stress. Some migrants have taken into agriculture and fishing. Measures to cope include borrowing money from local lenders at a very high rate, because some who could not work or who could not engage themselves in those actions which they were doing in the urban cities, they had to lend money from the lenders at a very high rate. One interviewee said that the migrants are working people who are not depending on charity from anybody. They do not want to depend on charity, but they are being forced to do so. And this is a representative from a Mumbai-based organization. However, in some other cases, migrants were heavily dependent on the government assistance, such as ration, medical facilities, and other free or highly subsidized items. They were unable to uh, adjust themselves or start some initiative at their native place. All the respondents mentioned in unanimity one sentiment, that loss of hope and feeling of not being supported by their employers is holding them back from returning to the cities, because when they return, it was believed that picture was very unclear whether these migrants will go back to their work or they will stay there, what will happen to their future. There were a lot of things that were very unclear, and the uncertainty and insecurity at the same time. So while pandemic has impacted urban as well as rural India and villages, the migrant have some kind of support system or a network of relative who would help in case of need. This is one of the difference we see in the urban and the rural area. Here, those migrants who lost job, who could not survive, but they at the same time they do not have someone to rely on, since in rural setup we see that the bond is very strong, and when you go back to your native place, you can easily ask somebody for some help, be it financial or physical or emotional. So this rural setting some way proved to be helpful for the migrants. We can call it as silver lining. Now, what were the civil society organizations' contribution to helping migrants? Uh, to help migrants, many organizations went beyond their capacity. Despite the threat of COVID-19, limited movement passes have not stopped these organizations from doing their work. As per the respondent, their organization tried to provide daily essentials. Some of the respondents said that they were into providing daily essential to the migrants, like the organization distributed both cooked and raw food kits to the migrant. Food parcels generally consisted of rice, wheat, pulses, and toothpaste, onion, potatoes in different quantities according to the organization. The respondent reveals that the government program of free distribution of food was beneficial during the lockdown. Also appreciated that the opening of Food Corporation of India warehouses for the organization to help government agencies distribute food, enabling access to food at a lower cost for distribution. One respondent said that the organization served for 21 days with the food and water to the migrants and their families. And for children, the organization distributed pencils, erasers, and drawing books. So, whereas some other organizations, they distributed basically medical kits. They distributed masks, sanitizers to the migrants and quarantine centers respectively. They also circulated short videos on social media, how to use sanitizers and other guidelines for the pandemic. Uh, Other organizations provided camp for the information and health awareness programs. Several respondents confirmed that their organization also helped in conducted testing for COVID-19, as well as help in the obtaining movement passes for migrants. Those times when the cases were increasing, it became difficult for testing itself become a difficult thing. And in rural areas where people are not very aware, not very educated, convincing them for testing was also a challenge. So it was not an easy task to deal with those kind of population. So one of the organizations motivated people by giving Karmveer Yodha Award. One of the NGOs volunteer informed me that their organization used to provide Karmveer Yodha Award to those people who had contributed in any way during the pandemic all over India. So these are kind of motivational stories to uh, inspire other people. Some organizations specifically helped undocumented migrants who were left without access to government services. Immediate medical services were also provided to those migrants who were in need with the help of some other civil society organizations. One organization engaged in returning migration workers to clean village rivers and wells. This organization said that their task was focused, and I found it interesting that how differently different organizations are trying to uh, engage with people at different level. This organization was primarily focused to the return migrants who have went to their native places, and asked them to engage in the community services, either cleaning of villages or cleaning of wells or cleaning of the near neighborhood areas. And by doing that, they used to provide a Pavitra Buddha. They started a Pavitra Buddha scheme, which is an additional to that, where people, leftover of people in terms of food, in terms of clothes or any utility stuff of home, they are distributed among those migrants who are needy and having not at all support. Civil society organizations face severe challenges while conducting their work. In terms of lack of communication with the higher authorities, we know that Indian government system has a highly bureaucratic structure, and to coordinate with this kind of structure itself is a big challenge. And for these civil society organizations, coordinate with the government authority was a challenge. And then lack of fund and resources were again major issues, because the pandemic, it's not that only migrant population were hit hard. All those who were funding, who were providing money to these organizations, their resources also dried up. So the income was stopped, and it stopped their work of this voluntary support to the organization. Organizations mentioned that vote bank politics by some local politician and corporations, access to healthcare was poor. The inability to travel to the remote areas was also a challenge. And however, some organizations believe that with proper planning and management, some of the challenges and lack of resources and funding could cover up. Uh, Yeah, again, the convincing, like I already mentioned, that convincing people, uneducated people about many safety measures and trying to teach them was also a challenge. Many a times people were suspicious and not very cooperative. However, while discussing about the good practices, what were the good practices that they identified during the lockdown period? One of the respondent mentioned that creation of emergency help service, providing customer care number to the people by local district magistrate in Bihar. It was proved to be a very helpful during the period of pandemic. The number was for people in distress during the pandemic, and provided by the local government. This policy was effective in providing great help to almost 2.5 million migrants who crossed Karmanasa border in Bihar, and it was hugely news that without any guidance, without any direction, these people are traveling and moving from one border to another. So some kind of help from these emergency help services. One respondent mentioned that if it were not for non-governmental organization and the work they did, it would have been even worse situation for migrants. One organization said that the guidelines issued by local administration was good, and it helped them to coordinate with the migrant population. The monitoring done by the local police was also helpful and found good by some of the organization. Some found it brutal because police used force, but some other found it useful. They said that because of the fear of the force of people, people used to follow the guidelines, and those who do not wear mask and ignored government guidelines, it was useful for them because they were compelled to do so. We see that the two phases of pandemic, like in 2020 and in 2021, we in 2020, when the risk was relatively low, because if we see the number of cases by that time, it was below 1% or 2%, but the fear was high. The complete lockdown, the uncertainty, the mental pressure, all the other things were at extreme. But when we came to the actual problem phase, the second phase, when we witnessed the people died in a huge number, and the number of infections also increased enormously. Like India was the second largest country who was infected, badly hit by the pandemic after USA. So, but the fear had gone out. In the second phase, I think we reached to the level chalo jo hoga dekha jayega, because everything was opened up by that time. People become careless and started working, and also they were not able to survive for longer period of time in a lockdown mode. So things had to open up. So these were the regulations that proved to be helpful. When asked about their partnership and collaboration and funding, some organizations said that they made collaboration with the bigger organization, or because there were several smaller organizations in the area, but they were lacking in some respect, but they had some advantages so that they can go and work at the grassroots level. But they lack in terms of funding, they lack in terms of networking, and to understand the know-how, how to proceed, how to go and reach. So they network with the bigger organization in the cities. Some organization have collaborated with the local government also to provide assistance, and in return got permission for movement to perform functions. One organization collaborated with the larger nationwide NGO and also received help in terms of resources. Further, apps such as WhatsApp helped in collaboration happen and helped to avoid overlap of work in some region. One of the respondents said that the role of technology is also very, very important, and we very well recognize this during this pandemic time, that creation of short videos to make people aware, creation of WhatsApp group, because it was very interesting to know that the person whom I was talking, he mentioned that in their area, several smaller organizations were there engaged in some or the other service providing, trying to provide services in one or the other section. What did they do? Because generally it happened that they are overlapping of work. One organization is providing food, other is also coming with food, other is also. So they created a kind of network. They created a WhatsApp group and started distributing location as well as services, that which area, which organization will go with what kind of support. So this helped in coordination, and I think it is very interesting and very good use of technology in the time of crisis. Collectives such as self-help groups, women group, youth group took lead in helping vulnerable. Yes, sir. Just I'm binding up, sir. Despite the threat of infection. Regarding funding, which is extremely important for this civil society organization, provided mixed responses. Some of them mentioned that their organization faced huge reduction in funding as their sources of funding dried up because they were also affected by the pandemic. On the other hand, some other organizations saw increase in the funding. It is very interesting because they clubbed with the new networks. They to generate new fundings. One organization mentioned that because of, again I will mention about this technology and the social media, one organization mentioned that since they were on Twitter and their account on Twitter was verified, they had a blue tick, which was considered authentic and genuine. So this blue tick helped them to have funding from many donors. They believed that this is a genuine, and so there were mixed responses in terms of funding. Some lost their funding, whereas some other organization, due to their networking with bigger organization and other reasons, they increased their funding. So these are some of the pictures for civil society organizations and their work in the rural areas. Policy suggestions, some of the policy suggestion is that first and foremost, what is important is documentation of migrants. Unless and until we do not have a clear picture, it is difficult, because any informed policy also required genuine data, regularization of labor, then increase in communication between government and civil society organization, which is one of the very important suggestion of my paper. Because we have seen in the time of pandemic how government also was willing to collaborate with civil society organization, because they believed that they were not able to reach out to the grassroots level and to reach and understand the people's problem at the grassroots level, and civil society organization need government supports for many of their functions. So increase in the minimum wages, employment creation in the rural belt, also very important. Measures to deal with the workplace accidents, rental housing and benefits of the government scheme, creating state-specific labor laws, which is very important, because now what happens that people migrate from one place to another place, leaving all the benefits one is getting at their native place, and also not able to get benefits where they have residing currently, because they do not have the documents to have those benefits. So this state-specific labor laws is important. And since we know that the portability of voting rights, this is maybe it look ahead of the time, talking ahead of the time, but since we know that all the politics, vote is one of the prime reason for all the politics take place, and why migrants have not been able to come to the mainstream, because they are not the ones who vote and they are not the ones who elect the government. So once these facilities would be extended to those migrants, I think their picture definitely would be changed for the positive. So I think I'll stop here, sir. Thank you.